Good morning to everyone. Thank you all for coming in and as we study the Word of God today. Today we are continuing our series looking at the book of the New Testament through the eyes of Genesis. Genesis Origins of Our Faith is the title of this series. And we're continuing our study. We are going to be looking at the general epistles today. Those are the books of the New Testament that were written to a general audience, the church in general. So that would be James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John are included in that list also, but we already looked at those as we looked at the author, John, when we looked at his gospel earlier this quarter. So these books or these epistles were written to an audience that were the church in general, the things that the church in general was struggling with at the end of the first century. As the church began to spread and grew in size, it was struggling with different audiences. It was facing different things, and so they certain things that they really struggled with were being addressed by these different authors, and they had similar messages throughout these, although they address slightly different topics as you go through them. And through their own lenses, but they're all united by their interest in their practical matters, such as the organizational leadership of the church, as well as how you followed the leaders in your community, how hard work is important, how fairness is important, the importance of good relationships, the importance of effective communication. They all reflect the essential challenge that Christians faced in the Roman Empire, though. How to follow Jesus in a tough environment. How do you follow after Jesus when the going gets tough? Early Christians faced problems such as slavery, favoritism, and abuse by the rich and powerful. They dealt with harsh words, and they dealt with conflicts. They dealt with real tensions between ambition and dependence on God. And the fear that doing things God's way would put them in conflict with those in authority. So in general, they felt a sense of alienation as they lived and worked in a world that seemed incompatible with following after Jesus. And that's just how they dealt with the outside world. Inside the church, they also dealt with false teachings. As the message of Christ got further away, more and more division sprang up within the church. False teachers came up with their own messages, and they think teachers like the Gnostics that saying that Jesus was separate, that he couldn't have been both fully human and fully divine at the same time, that he had to be one or the other. And there was others that said that the blood of Christ didn't matter that much, that was just an act that was there for the one time as a symbolic, and that it wasn't important. This was something that the early church was struggling with. How do they address those things, despite the teachings of the apostles, despite the teachings of Paul that was going around to all the churches and the others that were sent out? It was so important that they were on that common message, that then these writers wrote these out to the church to tell them how they should be living in their daily lives, as well as how they should be handling themselves inside the church. So let's take a look at how we're supposed to live in the world as a Christian. And what does the book of Genesis, how did that influence those New Testament authors as they began to teach, and what did they expect those audiences to know? Now, knowing that this is more of a general audience rather than a specific audience, they they didn't go in, most of these did not come and try and retell the Genesis story as we looked at some of them in the past, especially when we spent the last 2 weeks on Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written to the Jewish audience, as the name suggests, and so it was written to, and it retold the story because it helped familiarize, they were already familiar with it, but it helped to bring that more into recall as they went through those stories. These are going to be more general allusions for them to go back and study as they went through. And these books are really short. You could probably read through the entire thing of what we're going to study today in one sitting. The longest book is going to be James, and that's only 5 chapters. You're going to get through these pretty fast if you were to go through and read through them. But let's start there with James, and what are some passages that we can look at as we go through this. The first one is James chapter 2 and verses 18 through 26. Let's read through this real quick. But verse 18, but someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. James is continuing his argument of the importance of both faith and works. And in the early church, this was controversial, even up till for the last few centuries. It's been a controversial topic. Is it faith that saves us, or is it works? And James is not saying that it's works that saves us, and but he's saying that if you try and just live by faith alone, that's not sufficient. He's telling them that your works are a reflection of your faith. It's Jesus alone that saves us. It's not our works that will save us. We can't do anything to earn the grace of God. He's pointing out here, though, that Abraham, it was credited to him as righteousness for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar. And he talks about that as if that was a complete action because he was willing to go through with it short of what God stopped him at that very last moment. Because he trusted God, because of his faith, then in what he did. Now, Paul had made a similar argument when we studied this passage earlier, that it was credited to him as righteousness before he did this action. But James is saying that because of his faith, he was willing to carry through. He was willing to do actions such as offering his son and putting his son before, making sure that God was foremost in that relationship. And he also was willing to leave his own home, just as the author of Hebrews points out. So he's not making a contradiction here. He is showing how that when you have strong faith, your actions are going to be an easy reflection of that. Because if it's just a belief system, he's saying that the demons, in verse 19, the demons even do that. The people in early creation time believed that there was a God, but only Noah had faith enough to act upon the actions that God was telling him to do. The early stories of Genesis demonstrate how faith plus works, which is one of the central messages of James, is necessary to work together to show our faith and our works, and show the light of God to others around us. They're leading up to how it's the motivating power behind his work. James will show that Abraham's belief is what allowed him to be counted as righteous. His works were evidence of that faith, and therefore the evidence of his salvation. He goes on in chapter 3 to talk about the tongue as one of those things that could be a potential tripping point for the early church, and it's still a tripping point for us today. It's our tongue. Sometimes it's our fingers that do the texting or the typing that may get us in trouble today. But it's our communication. It's what comes out of it's our words that come out of our mouth. So let's read what James had to say on this. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings, for who have been made in God's likeness. Here James points out the difficulty in taming the tongue, using today what we would call a man on the moon argument. In modern terminology, we'll sometimes say, why is it that we can put a man on the moon, but we can't cure the common cold? We wonder some of those things, those moon shots, those great things that we've been able to accomplish, but we can't do something that would seem to be simple. And James is saying the same thing. He's saying, God put everything under man's dominion. He told us that we were to tame the animals. But if we can do that, if we could even in that day and time, if they could tame every animal that was alive on earth, why can't you just tame this one little thing? Why can't you control this one little organ that's inside your mouth and control how that is affecting your relationships? Because if your relationships are not pure by the way that you are in your communication, then how can you be both praising God and cursing people at the same time? You're not tamed if you're not using both, if you're not edifying both, if you're not both praising God and edifying your fellow man. And how does that communication why is that communication so important? Because it's important because of the righteousness of God. It is an exemplary part of our behavior. Jesus talked about that out of our heart, what comes out of our mouth is what's coming out of our heart. That out of our heart is the wellspring of our life. And if we're not mimicking with our words what is edifying to everyone around us and building up those relationships, it's probably because something isn't right inside. Well, sometimes I this last week had to make the excuse, well, I was hangry. I was both hungry and so because of my hunger and being irritated with something, I had to make an apology because I was not acting in a way that was edifying. Yeah, when we get tired, when we sometimes get tired or hungry, sometimes those true characteristics show up. But is that not what sometimes is, or that's not what in our heart? Are we putting on a mask? That when those other emotions start to show up, We've got to work to clean our hearts. And that's the only true way that we can tame that tongue, is if it's being tamed by what is truly, if what's in the heart is going to come out, then we can truly tame the tongue. He also makes an odd turn of phrase in chapter 3, verse 6, where he talks about the world of unrighteousness. And that's an allusion back to the fall in Genesis chapter 3, 1 through 19. Particularly as this is a good parallel between this, because it talks about how the created order was created by the words of God. And when that created order was spoken into existence by God, all it took was one word to tear it down. It was when God set the order in place, all it took was one word by the serpent being added into the phrase of, "You shall not surely die." When God's commandment said, "You shall surely die," all it took was one extra word to change that. And James is making that parallel between the created order of the world and that one word that was so important at that time. It's the serpent's portrayal in James chapter 3, verse 8 is a more suggestive fashion, also bringing that into play when he talks about the catastrophic effects of the serpent's tongue. He brings up the fact that it's poisonous. He brings up the fact that it's full of deadly poison. Is the wording there, bringing that up to light. He doesn't specifically call it that serpent there, but that's what's going to be full of deadly poison. He brings that to their mind to remember, help them to remember not to fall into the temptation that becomes whether it's from the word or whether it's from the world, and to be careful for those little situations. He concludes that the tongue can be both a blessing and a curse, just as in those early chapters of Genesis, where the word was both the blessing of a good creation and the cursing of a deceptive servant. In James chapter 5, he brings in another situation. In verse 4, he says, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud, they are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." Here James charges these abusive rich men, these men of the early church, not just with neglect and selfishness, but with outright fraud. He's saying that the businessmen that cheated their own employees out of the wages that they had earned while working in the fields is reminiscent of the way that Cain was tied to his blood. The blood of Abel was crying out. In the Old Testament law, employees were commanded to pay their laborers at the end of the workday because the workers needed the money, and they might cry out to the Lord if cheated by their employer. James describes the unpaid money itself as crying out against the oppressive landowners, along with the voices of the workers. This thematic association of laborers in the field crying out for wages is akin to the same phraseology that was used, that Abel's blood was crying out from the ground against the sin of his brother Cain. Abel was a typology of the righteous one in verse 6, killed by his brother, such that his blood cries out from the ground. The Jewish traditions construed Abel as an archetype of unjust suffering, while Cain becomes an exemplar of exploitative profiteering. If Abel is that unjust suffering and Cain is making gain because of this, then there's this comparative template that James is making. He's made the points of live your lives so that they can be holy. Then he comes along and talks about tame your tongue so that your relationships can be sweet no matter who you're with. And then finally here in James chapter 5, he tells them that as a businessman, you should be the best example. Make sure that you're doing what's honest and just in the way that you live in this world. Let's take a look at 1 Peter next. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 reads, "For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening." Earlier in this book, Peter had pointed out examples of women who had come before. We looked at that about the adorning. The others have talked about the adorning of the flesh when we looked at that back in Timothy. But Peter is specifically talking about in here that of women that had come before. Now he's specifically referring to Sarah as one of those holy women. These were holy women who hoped in God and were exemplary in how they lived in front of their husbands. Since all Christian women who are now reading this are also holy, they're set apart for God's purposes, not those of the world. They should also find their true beauty in the way that they live by submitting to their own husbands. Peter cites the example of Abraham's wife, Sarah. Jewish readers would have grown up learning about Abraham and Sarah. And a major part of Israel's history was how they trusted God to lead them through a strange country, through all their travels across all of the Middle East, and into a new home, and to give them children to begin the nation of Israel. Those readers would also remember that Sarah was renowned for her great beauty, and that Abraham was not exactly the model husband sometimes. In fact, Abraham feared, it tells us of two different occasions that he feared that he would be killed by men who thought that they wanted Sarah for themselves. So he let those men believe that he and Sarah were brother and sister, which was partially true. They were half brother, half sister, but they were. But he let them take them back to their home. So there was twice that he did this, but Sarah submitted through all of those situations into Abraham's leadership. Peter insists that Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord because she put her trust in God, though not in Abraham. Women who make that same choice and refuse to give in to fears about being provided for or personal worth or what they feel they deserve will become Sarah's children by being like her. Notice that Sarah, not Abraham, is the one that Peter holds out as honorable in this passage. Those who follow her example also receive honor, attain an unfading beauty, and succeed in pleasing God. He continues on later on in this chapter, in verses 18 through 21, where he talks about Noah and baptism. Beginning verse 18. "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." The context of this passage is easily seen as the flood narrative from Genesis chapter 6, where it says Noah and the ark. It's one of the things that's important to notice in this is Peter's reference to God's patient forbearance. It is likely the allusion to Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. Likewise, the 8 saved is telling us of the the preservation of Noah's extended family. Peter puts this, though, in the relationship of what the early church was going through, that it was necessary for the patience, because Noah had 100 years while he was building the boat to preach to the people around him. It tells how he preached to the people over and over again to try and call them back to the Lord. For 100 years, he knew the calling of God. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He didn't know the day it was going to happen yet until the time. But as he continued to progress on this large structure, building it by hand with rudimentary tools at the time, he was taking the time to preach to those around him and tell them about why he was doing what he was doing and trying to save as many people as possible in the ark. God wanted them to be called back to him. He didn't want to only save 8. He would have loved to have saved the entire world, to put off saving the flooding of the world. Just as he put off the destruction of Nineveh when Jonah preached and they repented. But they refused. They refused. And because of this, then they refused to follow after God, and they went only after more and more evil. It says in Genesis chapter 6 that there was only evil all the days that they were there. And there was only one righteous man, and that of Noah. And he brought along his family along with him. But it was the same thing that the early church is feeling. I'm sitting here with my friends. I'm sitting there with my friends, and I see all the evil that's going on in the Roman culture. And I don't know what to do in the midst of this evil culture that I see going around me. They flaunt all their evilness and only find more and more ways to do evil. And the early church saying, why should I continue to believe in this? And Peter reminds them that it was the same way with Noah. That even in the midst of all this evil, remember your baptism. Remember how you decided to put on Jesus Christ in baptism and be saved through waters. Those same waters were salvation to Noah and thousands of years ago. They're the same waters that saved you today. As you went down into them and came back up, you were saved so that you no longer have to be like that. And so because you were saved, you need to live differently. It wasn't just that you took a bath. It wasn't just an outward sign of an inward grace, as some people say today. This was the act that at that time you decided that you were going. This was your one act, and that act doesn't make sense as what would really be saving us, but it's what God commands. And because of that command, just like the ark didn't make sense at the time when Noah started building it 100 years before rain had ever fallen on the earth, we look today to see back to our baptism, to see that it's important for us to remember. It's important for us to remember our baptism and how we were saved, and how we continue to be saved because of the grace of God. But notice it was the ark, not the water, that saves Noah and his family. Yet Peter, he wants to make that baptismal connection. He attributes the saving power of the water to the water instead. As Noah was delivered by water from the evil of the world, so also will the Christian is continuing to be saved by the waters of baptism. We're going to take a detour into Jude, because Jude was probably written before 2 Peter, just based on the way that they reference each other. And look at a few passages in Jude. And Jude can be a strange book as you read through it. It makes some references to some extra biblical texts as it goes through there, referring to a text called that the history of Enoch. But he's not saying that's the text. It's more just here's the traditions of what you know. Here's your story. But he also makes reference to them, what they would know through Genesis in the text of those days. So let's look at a few in there. First one that he makes reference to is in Genesis chapter 6 in verse 6 of Jude. And it said, "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." He's the main emphasis of Jude, the theme of Jude, is the opposing of false teaching. Remember that Jude was an apostle. He was the half brother of Jesus. He was the brother of the apostle James, who we just got through studying, and he was one of the primary leaders, if not the leader of the church in Jerusalem. But he's writing this to the church in general, but beyond the borders of Jerusalem. And he's talking about he's writing about the salvation that he and his readers had in common, but also the threat of false teaching. In this verse, in verse 6, he's referring to the angels that rebelled against God's authority. They're charged with leaving their assigned role and leaving heaven. The statement may refer to either the rebellion in heaven that Satan led against God that we see in Isaiah and Ezekiel, but it's also most likely what we read in Genesis chapter 6, where we read about the sons of God, and they were cohabiting with the daughters of man, and there's these beings called the Nephilim that were around as a result. And when you read through just these 4 short verses in Genesis chapter 6, you're like, we don't know the context, because it doesn't make sense to us because they're no longer around. We have these 4 short verses and this short reference in Jude chapter 6, or Jude verse 6, that is talking about these Nephilim that were there. The important message to gain out of it, though, is just as it was the false teachings that were coming about, and the same false teaching that was same way that false teaching was happening back in Genesis chapter 6, the same way that it was happening when Jude was writing to them, and the same way that it's happening today also. False teaching is destructive in its nature. And he's warning them that God is not going to stand for false teachings. That just the same way that God punished the people in Genesis chapter 6, the same way that he takes care of it throughout time, false teaching is an abomination to him. He does not want the false teaching to occur. Because then it distorts the truth that he has. And he wants the people to be able to look for it. It doesn't say whether this punishment is an ongoing thing, that he's going to take care of it at the time, or if they were going to be like those that suffered in the lake of burning sulfur that John talks about in Revelation. But he wants them to know that God's going to take care of them. Your job is to look for truth. God's job is God is going to take care of those others. Don't worry about trying to punish them. God is going to take care of them. But your job is to look for truth and to find that truth in God's word and not in the extra things. He goes on in verse 7 to say, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued a natural desire, they serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire." In this verse, Jude presents another example of God's punishment for those who despise his laws and follow their own sinful lusts. So he's talked about false teachers. Now he's talking about how that there's people that do what they want to do no matter what. They don't care what God says. They're going to do what they want to do. They're not trying to deter you from being that way, from following after God. But they're going to do what they want to do. And he tells them that's just like what Sodom and Gomorrah. There's nothing new under the sun. People will do what they want to do. Because they're just rejecting God. And he tells them that those people are just going to be like what you're seeing around you today. What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah may not be exactly like that, but they are going to receive punishment. Abraham's nephew Lot even had been attracted to Sodom because of the pasture land that surrounded the city. And he thought that he would be better off by being amongst the cities. But the punishment that those wicked inhabitants received, it pictures the punishment that waits those who are false teachers and those who are going after their own lusts today. They knew what they were supposed to be doing because of the teachings of the church. When we could just have to continue to shine the light of what God is showing for us.
The depravity is progressive, gains momentum, and penetrates deeper and deeper.
It can,
just sit still.
Barry says that the depravity continues to grow. It doesn't just sit still. The people find more and more evil ways they think they're inventing new ways to be there, to be evil in their own time. But there's just so much that they continue to find. There's nothing new. It was all done. It was all done back in Genesis. They're not inventing anything new. They think they are. They think they're finding new ways to be evil, but God tells us through the teacher in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just people are coming back and they're cycling back through that same level of evil that's there, and we see it in our culture today. But our call is to be light. Our call is to be a light in a dark world. The good thing about a dark world is that light shines even brighter in a dark world. If you are truly following after God, how much? If this room was pitch black, if it was dark outside, the lights were all off in here. How much light does it take you to be able to see? One light bulb in here would be enough to all of a sudden light up this room, enough to be able to see. But the more light you put in this room, the more lights we turn on in here, the better we can see. And that's our call as Christians, to be lights in this world. One light in a really dark space is all it takes. But the more light we put out in the world, the better off it's going to be, because Jesus is that light. He goes on in verse 11 to say, woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. He talks about the three indictments against false teachers. One of these is in Genesis. They were the following after Cain's example. Cain was the first human that was born naturally to his parents Adam and Eve. They were the first human beings that were created by God. The Lord accepted Abel's offering, which was a blood sacrifice offered in faith, but he rejected Cain's offering of the fruits of the field. Following Cain's example, the false teachers despised Jesus' blood sacrifice and devised their own corrupt worship. They rejected the sacrifice of God. That was one of the false teachings that I told you about earlier. Furthermore, Jude's connection to Cain implies some level of jealousy. Just as Cain was jealous of Abel, even so the false teachers were jealous of those who obeyed the Lord, and they hated genuine believers. He tells them, woe to them. Jude is not so much offering an extended retelling or reworking of the Genesis narratives, as much as he is putting together a series of evidential examples of characters who typify the actions and destiny of the opponents of the gospel. He brings out three specific examples from the book of Genesis that tell of how God takes care of those who oppose him, and how you can reference them back to that. So now let's take a look at 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 10. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. This tells 3 different examples going through here of how, connecting all these similar ones that what we just read from in Jude. But Peter takes it from both sides. He gives you both the hero and the villain. He tells of how puts Noah against those of the unrighteous. He puts Sodom and Gomorrah against those of Lot, and how Lot continued to live in that time. And he also talks about in verse 4 the angels and those. If he wouldn't spare them, why would he those who are false teachers? Why would he do any less to people of the world? He was concerned with the false teachers who were greedily spreading lies about Christ's authority. They encourage Christians to indulge in sexual sin. They pursue erotic desires in the open. They're experts in greed. They despise authority. They live in bold arrogance. And they blaspheme things that they just don't understand. Peter assures them that these deceivers will be punished for the harm that they've caused. He tells them that these people are not any different than what we've already looked at in Jude. If God didn't spare sinful angels, the wicked of Noah's day, or the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, he's not going to spare the false teachers of their day or the false teachers of today either. The people around are going to be continuing to look for ways to sin. We've already been talking about that so much today. But we are called to be that. To hold fast, to trust that God is going to take care of them, and to just do what we're supposed to be doing. He goes to give one more in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. But they deliberately forgot that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. Peter reveals the flaw in a deceptive argument, forgetting about some huge details as they're going through this. They forgot about that God is the creator. If we forget that God is the creator, that he's in charge, that he took from nothing, formed it into water, and then formed the land. Out of the land he formed all the animals and man. If we forget that, then how are we going to remember anything else? Because that argument of creation, that God is all powerful, that he is the one that is saving, he saved then, he can save today. Now the water was used, then the water was used to create. Today the water is used to save. The heavens came into being by God's word, Peter writes, and that same powerful world is what the false teachers are mocking when they dismiss the return of Christ and God's judgment for sin. God will do as he will with his creation, and judgment is coming. Peter reminds his readers that these false teachers are also forgetting a huge moment in history. There have been times in the physical world when God intervened in order to bring judgment. As recorded in Genesis 6 through 9, God brought the great flood and destroyed nearly all of the life he created. In other words, God has already done in the past exactly what the false teachers were saying that he will not do in the future. In our day, many dismiss the idea of Noah's flood, calling it a myth, a fable, or an exaggeration. Even some religious teachers are eager to dismiss that cataclysmic event. Peter clearly believed in and taught the reality of Noah's flood. The rainbow is there as a promise for us that he won't destroy it by water next time. But that isn't the case. It doesn't have to be water. Next time it's going to be fire. So when we look at the events in the world around us, we continue to groan about the things that are going on around us. But it's our job just to be light in this dark world. Next week we're going to, they cut off my last slide. Next week we're going to look at Revelation. And we're going to be studying through that. That's going to be our last week on this topic. Thank you for your attention, and hope that you have a blessed day and the rest day of worship.